Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth is joined by the authors of a recent article we discussed on the podcast. Mark Horowitz and Anthony Haynor generously offered to share their thoughts in this follow-up. Hi, and welcome back to the Dissidents podcast. Today, we're very lucky to have as our guests the authors of a paper that Mike Burke and I recorded a podcast with, an article about which we recorded a couple of weeks ago. And the authors contacted us and said that they would be willing to come on and talk to us further about their findings, things that maybe didn't make the article, other research that they've done. So I'm going to let Anthony Haynor and Mark Horowitz introduce themselves a little more thoroughly. So Anthony, can I start with you?
Yes. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. And my main areas of expertise are sociological theory, social change, self and society, social problems.
That's a lot.
Right. Okay. I will stop there. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. So, Mark?
Yes, Elizabeth, wonderful to be here. I, too, am a associate professor of sociology, just a couple of doors down from Anthony. I teach social theory as well, but I also focus on biosociology, political psychology, and social movement.
I'm so happy for the two of you that you have each other. You may have gleaned from our podcast that I'm not quite so lucky, and that's one of the reasons, though, that we started the podcast was for a sense of community and to have listeners. It's selfish in that I get to talk to people like you, and then also to have listeners not feel quite so alone. I had sent both of you an article. I say article; it's an op-ed, basically. It's an opinion piece, but it's by Magnus and Waugh, and we'll link it in the podcast notes. The hyper-politicization of higher ed, trends in faculty political ideology from 1969 to the present. So your research, of course, focuses more current, but I think that this article does a good job of sort of situating us in history. They describe, they say, just from 1969 to 1998, the share of faculty identifying as liberal or far left shifted only 0.1%. So from almost 45% to almost 45%, 44.7 to 44.8. And I think that's, I don't know. I think that's really important to realize that this hasn't always been the case, right? That, now 44.7, that kind of mischaracterizes, I do think, because everyone's center and right would be in the other 50%, right? So it kind of makes it sound like, oh, less than 50% are liberal, but it's kind of, then we also have the center and the right. So there's a lot. It's still a significant, percentage of faculty who were, left or far left. But then between 1998 and 2001, so just 3 years, faculty opinion took a hard left in such that faculty on the political left are now approaching a super majority. And that is exactly what you found, right, in your research, in the project that we covered, but also in other projects, right, that there's this sort of super majority on the left.
Yeah, most definitely. When I read that essay that you sent along, Elizabeth, it showed that most fields now, vast majority, over half, some up as high as 80%. I think our field, sociology, is one of the most sort of dramatic illustrations of left liberal predominance. The surveys we carried out of sociologists, we did a couple of them, had well over 80% were liberal or radical, and in anthropology as well. So it certainly confirms the case made by those authors.
And also a part of the original article and the case that Anthony wanted to make sure that we have time to make here is that the politicization of university faculty will sort of, this author is saying, in as early as 1999, somebody was arguing that this is going to undermine public confidence in higher ed and, affect grading, and just, I think that we are in a vulnerable position, higher ed in general, and this certainly isn't isn't helping. And I think you found evidence of that also in your research.
I think most definitely. Conservative elements historically have greeted the integration of more and more of the public into higher ed with some degree of skepticism. So I think there's always been opposition by conservative elements in society to the expansion of higher ed, but we're playing into the hands right now with such overwhelming one-sidedness in higher education. Both Anthony and I are members of Heterodox Academy, which of course advocates for more viewpoint diversity. There are, I think, deep political consequences, which we can talk about, for what's going to happen to higher ed as it continues to lose public trust. But our research deals, and Anthony's been part of my research team on these questions, our research deals with what the intellectual or empirical consequences are of having this kind of echo chamber of left liberals in higher education. So I'll certainly talk about that as well.
So I was wondering what either or both of you thought about. So this is the bottom of page 360. So they talk about, and the top of 361. So what they're making, I think this kind of bothered me, and I can't quite put my finger on it. But they're saying, in the 1960s and 70s, 70s and 80s, the literature was focusing on how professors responded to the great political issues of the day, such as the Vietnam War, campus protests, sit-ins, South African divestment, race and gender issues. And one of the things that they said was that, these were once radical positions that aren't necessarily radical positions, aren't seen as radical positions today. And it says something, they say, this must be remembered with any conclusions that are offered. The very nature of political inquiry is implicated here. Some argue that because academia focuses on expanding ideas, it's inherently opposed to conservatism, blah, blah, blah. I was wondering what you thought about this argument, because I hear it a lot that, for, the broke woke stroke kind of stuff is on the right side of history. And so that we're behind and that eventually they will be, on the right side of history, and this kind of work to transform education into something different, more inclusive, maybe more interested in social activism than in traditional education and that kind of thing, that eventually will come around. I don't know. What do you think about that argument that they sort of like snuck in there?
Well, in the article on hyper-politicization, I jotted this down, that I think up as many 80% of professors indicate that social justice is an important mission.
Yeah.
So that struck me. Another thing that struck me is the gap between faculty and students.
Yes.
So you have increasingly left-leaning faculty. According to the data they cite, most students are more in the middle, or they're not as left as the average professor in many of these fields. So what are the implications of that? How do we deal with that gap? So I found those.
Yeah, and not only were 80% more left-leaning, but I think that I have this right, that I'm looking for that spot. Oh yeah, 80.6% of faculty encourage students to become agents of social change. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Social change. I mean, again, that kind of relates back to my other question. So like, what kind of social change are we saying that you should be students, you should be advocates of social change, or are we saying to students you should be advocates of this kind of social change? And I'm not sure. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a significant danger. Even if one were to make the case, which I think you alluded to that, Elizabeth, that there's this kind of overall gradual liberalization of the culture through higher ed, that doesn't mean that there could be a change. Past trends don't guarantee future outcomes, right? And maybe, I could hear a conservative in the room right now saying, if anything, we need to go the other way at this point. We've gone too far. And from an empirical point of view, our research has demonstrated that, we can talk about this too, highly plausible, if not obvious, conclusions about human nature, for example, are denied by these overwhelmingly, largely liberal left social scientists. So we're intellectually stunting the future growth of our students. We're undermining critical thinking. So I think the idea that, in the long run, we're all becoming liberal, well, maybe not. And maybe a case could be made that we actually do need. And we make this case with regard to merit in the paper. We make the case that we need to reclaim the values of, grit and hard work, which have largely disappeared. I don't know about you, Elizabeth, but Anthony and I comment on this a lot with each other. We don't really even hear lip service to merit anymore.
No. In fact, we were, before we even really started, I was saying, we're not allowed to speak of it in the hallways. If you bring up something about student, unprepared, students and that kind of stuff, it's, it's like, shh, we don't mention that. It's got to be rah or nothing kind of thing, and it does. I don't know. It just that really bothered me, that the suggestion, and maybe it's a throwaway sort of like, oh, don't cancel me kind of thing. It's like, well, maybe society will come around, like you said, like, oh, we're all going to shift that way, and we will be on the right side of history after all. But that statement just bothers me, that what was once was we're radical isn't radical anymore, so we'll just wait for everybody to come around to this, and it won't be radical anymore to think a particular whatever that way is. And certainly it's true that we self-select as academics, right? We are more open to experience, and we are naturally more curious and maybe forgiving of diverse ideas and stuff when we start, certainly when we start out, maybe not so much now. And so we're self-selecting into academia because of our openness to experience, and openness is correlated with liberalism. So we shouldn't really necessarily be surprised, I guess, that's sort of the trend. But what were you going to say, Anthony? I interrupted.
No, we highlight in the study, in the discussion, the signaling function, the historic signaling function that the university, one could argue for much of history, took very seriously, to put the institution's imprimatur on. We give witness to the student possessing a certain skill set and having a certain basic knowledge, and we also think that's really been eroded. That it's not talked about, it's not mentioned, it's not really taken seriously, or it's reframed in more in equity terms. I don't know. I just think we think there's been a shift.
Well, and I think
away
that
from that
in the
mission.
open-ended responses, right? That's what you actually found people were highly critical of you even asking questions that were framed in a particular way.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Mark, if you're prepared to share any of those, but I think those were just incredibly powerful. Not just the survey answers, but the open-ended interjections.
Yeah, and I would add, Elizabeth, you had mentioned kind of pressure to be hush-hush about preparedness. I think even more pressure is placed on being hush-hush about intellectual ability. And, in Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, he talked about this, where academics, we're very quick to point out intellectual deficits of, say, a politician on the right or something, and yet we never really want to talk about intellectual ability. It's a taboo, and yet it's so obvious. In my own family, we all recognize different people have different skills and capacities. Yet and this is one of those unintended consequences of this rising liberal predominance, I think it carries with it. And that's something that Mike and you didn't touch on. And I don't know if it's of interest to the audience, but there is a political psychological underpinning or interpretation that we make. It draws from the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, and it has to do with the sensibilities that left liberals have, so compassionate toward vulnerable groups. We actually, in a prior paper, Anthony and I wrote, we talk about the sociology sacred victims, where vulnerable people are seen as sacred, kind of set apart. And I think that sensibility is carried by these liberal faculty members toward these vulnerable students, where, like you said earlier, you can't talk about this. It's intrinsically sexist to say we either have or should have a meritocracy. That's intrinsically racist to say that. And it makes Anthony and I step back and go, well, who's going to be building our bridges? Who's going to be teaching our students if we continue to chip away at the foundations of merit? And even what I'm just saying now will be potentially condemned. It's like, how dare you say we aren't high merit? Well, why aren't we talking about merit then? Why aren't we stressing it? And last point, we cite in the piece an article by Jack and Safi called "It's Time to Eliminate the Word Rigor."
Oh, yes.
Explicit about it. I don't know if it was an Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle.
I think it was Chronicle. I think it was the Chronicle.
So this is the explicit move that we're confronting today, and it did indeed get manifested in a lot of rather hostile responses, because we ask questions like, there's an increased number of students that are not intellectually suited. That's even stronger than saying unprepared, right? And left liberal academics sort of bristle at that. So there are costs to this liberal left predominance, and I should say, I'm somebody who came out of the left my entire life. I was quite social justice oriented as a progressive, so it's been kind of a bruising transformation that I've had as I'm looking at contemporary trends.
I'm not sure how we can advance social justice causes. Let's just, and this gets to your Scientific American piece, which I'll also link, but how can we hope to do research that truly illuminates, let's say, social justice issues, if we don't use our scientific training to do so? And our scientific training suggests that we should be looking at problems from multiple angles, because guess what? We could be wrong about our hypothesis. So we should ask, and you ask questions in ways that, multiple questions to get at the same construct, right? So that we can, make sure that people, that our questions aren't biased, that we're not confusing people. We have bad questions in there, and we're compensating for that, right? By asking questions from multiple perspectives and asking more than one question. So when people responded to your study, like, how dare you ask that question? That the fact that you ask this question demonstrates your, white supremacy attitudes, your, biases of multiple kinds that they, accused you of. These were not lay people responding to your study. These were academics. So what would you, we can't answer the survey, but like, if you were to answer some of these survey responses, we were to sit down and have a conversation with some of them, what are some of the things that you would like to say, questions you would like to ask of them about their own training and perspective?
I have a thought on that, Anthony. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Well, one thing I would say is that science presupposes that knowledge is not settled, right, or there is a significant portion of the universe that is open, where we should be open to discovering the truth. So when you go in a priori way and say this is the truth, and you front load it, so then science then it just becomes sort of a cherry picking operation. But you already had your mind made up. So one of the things I try to communicate, we try to communicate to our colleagues when this issue comes up is what you're arguing, what you're asserting, is it really settled knowledge, or is there any wiggle room for alternative interpretations? And sometimes you get funny looks when you ask that question, because I think depending on how radical left you are, you tend to say, well, of course this is the way it is, right? So if you don't, so what, if you're even asking the question, then you're in some sense supportive of an evil status quo.
Yeah.
Is the way they see it.
So
No,
what were you going to say, Mark?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I would follow what Anthony just said. The heterodox academy folks often quote John Stuart Mill, he who knows only his own case knows very little of that. So the injunction, and this is something that I think is most helpful with who I perceive to be my most dogmatic fellow progressive colleagues, is when I ask them, have you read anyone whose ideas you staunchly disagree with lately? I'd be curious about what you think of that. And what you'll find, and I know this because in part due to my own transformation, you'll find that they don't.
Right.
So they're choosing texts that bake into them those sorts of assumptions that left liberal intellectuals have. And I hinted at this earlier when we mentioned liberal predominance, but there's an intellectual damage that's done as well, ironically, as a social justice damage, because you're not going to advance social justice on the basis of faulty assumptions or inaccurate understandings of the world. So one of the prior surveys that we carried out surveyed sociologists on sensitive controversies. One of them had to do with possible biological component with men and women and their career choices. This fits a kind of conservative view that women are on average more nurturant. There's a wide array of literature that suggests that women gravitate to more people-oriented fields. One of the findings that has been pretty impactful is that many of the most gender egalitarian societies are precisely those where you see a greater degree of gender disparity by field. All of these elementary facts end up getting policed out of discussion, so then students aren't hearing them. And ironically, the more educated left liberal faculty are, the more disengaged from reality on certain themes they are, particularly if it has to do with vulnerable groups, and the more disengaged they are from the student body, and ultimately unhelpful when it comes to bringing about social change, because large swaths of the mass public look at higher ed and say, well, if they can't even acknowledge these elementary truths about the world, then why should we trust them at all?
Yeah, and there's this aspect of science that already makes people skeptical, and we embrace it, but this idea that one study leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So each one, as Anthony said, we're looking for this big capital T truth, but we also know that we're only chipping away at it. And so to us, I mean, that's one of the things that drew us to scientific inquiry, was that there's always more to learn, right? And yet the general public, as is like, well, we're anxious to know, and our students, I mean, we know this, and our students will just tell me the right answer, right? Kind of like just get to the end, right? This impatience, with us as academics, and so as you say, we're sort of playing into that by we're making this distrust or this mistrust in science, I think, worse by perpetuating this this one-sided kind of investigatory methodology or questioning or whatever. And again, I mean, you even had people quit the study, right, that we reviewed in the previous podcast. They just wrote in there, you're racist, and we quit. Right.
Yeah, the hostility that it unleashes ends up confirming that political psychology we suggested earlier. You have people that are, in a sense, emotively oriented to sacralize victim groups, to like treat them as just set apart, trigger ready to sort of contest authority. And they're all joined in a kind of echo chamber of assumptions that creates a campus culture where ideas that run counter that jeopardize one's career. And go back to your earlier point, Elizabeth, about the roots of this and self-selection. I think there was that book by Neil Gross a number of years ago, made the case that most of it, if not all of it, is self-selection. It's probably both self-selection and some degree of bias in hiring committees, where you're not so much looking for a person with the academic intellectual credentials. You're looking at with someone who shares the same underlying moral assumptions, and it may not be conscious, or it may be conscious depending on the search committee. And over time, both that and self-selection have led to the sorry state that we're in today, with such overwhelming left liberal predominance. And again, I say sorry state because I know from our research that elementary hypotheses or ideas with a high degree of plausibility are rejected out of hand, often with deep emotional opposition.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into, current, sort of like standpoint epistemology, the sort of like, that I think most of us historically have tried to educate students about, like, oh, wait a minute, you're biased by your N of one personal perspective and everything. But now we're seeing faculty members do it within your study. People with PhDs saying, I believe X and you're asking me about Y. How dare you ask me about Y? It offends me, right? How could your IRB approve this? And of course, that's close to my heart as an former IRB chair, whose IRB was essentially dissolved by an issue very similar to this, where a hypothesis was being investigated with one aspect of an experimental, questioning that offended somebody, posted it on the internet, and, essentially took down an entire research program and an institutional review board. Now, this was at the height of, we were at the stay at home, like online, like, I think that, well, I can't imagine having had over 10,000 people in my various research studies, and never having had that happen. I can't imagine that would have happened in an in-person study where somebody handed someone materials and said, we're here, here to answer any questions or whatever. But that doesn't absolve or explain away my own colleagues' behavior towards us. We might say, oh, well, students didn't, even though they got an orientation to research and signed up for a research program and, platform and chose a study and read a consent form and blah, 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 blah. We can, you can say, okay, well, students weren't properly prepared in whatever way that means, regardless of our attempts to prepare them. What absolves faculty? Like what redeems them in this process? I mean, I hope somebody who got your survey, listened to this and saw themselves in this, and I don't know, I don't hold out much hope, but is embarrassed about the way that they responded, or is reflective. How can we? I mean, we're talking about the seriousness of this, and that it may undermine education as we know it. I mean, I don't know how we reach our colleagues and inspire the reflectiveness that I assumed drew them to, higher ed.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that it's going to be obtained through pure argument. I think we're going to need more viewpoint diversity. We're going to need more people in higher ed that have different points of view. I mean, there is another side to it where I think the conservative elements are a bit blinded, where, and we make this case in the paper, where they don't seem to want to acknowledge the reality of this kind of student debt regime and the pressure that places on universities. Often conservatives they kind of bristle at the idea that corporate principles are problematic. They tend to embrace the market, and yet we're seeing its kind of perverse consequences on faculty around the country, where, almost half acknowledge routinely inflating grades, right? A third of them have been watering down their courses. So there's these subtle and not so subtle pressures that have ultimately, I think, at least in large part, financial imperative undergirding them. Conservatives sort of don't engage that. So we need the conservatives in higher ed to give counterpoint to some of our assumptions about human nature, about race and gender that are skewed and one-sided. And I think the conservatives need higher ed liberals and leftists to acknowledge the role of kind of the perverse incentives that purely market-driven education brings about. So I think working hand in hand, building public trust in higher ed, crossing the ideological aisle, not demonizing our opponents. And again, it starts with that earlier point I made. If you're not going out of your way to read arguments that you find repellent, you're not growing. So both Anthony and I, we work in one of the programs in our department called Social and Behavioral Sciences. And we've structured it really around controversy. And students are required to read books that take positions that really make them uncomfortable, as well as books that align with their assumptions, right? And it takes some degree of finesse to be able to pull that off effectively. But I think that model, not to be self-aggrandizing, but that model should be generalized around the country, where more and more people are going out of their way to integrate into their courses ideas that run counter their sensibilities. If we're not going to have the conservative faculty at higher ed, or if that's going to be a slow process, at least have them read some of these conservative authors that make important contributions to a lot of these questions.
So, Anthony, how long have you been teaching, Anthony?
At Seton Hall, about 25 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would challenge anybody. So I've been teaching about 25 years too, not just where I am, but 20 years where I am. I would challenge anybody who's been teaching for more than 10 to look at a syllabus that they prepared 10, 15, 20 years ago for a course in whatever, whether it's statistics and research methods, or whether it's a content more, a more content specific, area specific course, and see whether you think your students today would be capable of doing the reading and, engaging in, with the content, but also passing exams and those kinds of things. And whether you could get away with it, whether you could get away with, with asking students whether essentially you would have a mass exodus, maybe complaints or whatever. I don't know if you've noticed that, Anthony. I mean, I was asked not that long ago to teach a course I hadn't taught since, I don't know, maybe 2018 or something. And I went back to it and I was like, holy cow, this syllabus is useless to me. There's no way.
I know that that's occurred, and I would say in my own courses as well over the years. I think one of the main insights of our study is to point to the existence of strange bedfellows, to use that expression. So you have, Mark was talking about corporatization. So you have sort of bottom line, right? How can we increase admission, maximize retention? What's the business model? All right. But then you have woke types who are all about equity, right? Trying to reduce, if not eliminate, disparities in educational outcomes. Then you have these sort of compassionate types. I'm thinking of recent work by Haidt and Twenge, the anxious generation. So they're responding to that. But these three interests, if you want to call them that, on many things they may not agree, but they are sort of rowing their oars in the same direction. Let's put it that way. When it comes to eroding standards. And that's the argument we make, that you would say, well, what do woke people and corporate types have in common? I think each in their own way they have a vested interest in eroding meritocracy as we have traditionally understood the term. I don't know, Mark, do you want to add something?
100% agree. There's a fundamental tension there between the value of merit and these other values that we care about. So we make this point, sort of a subtle one, that these are all legitimate values. We should care about equity. We should care about solvency. We should have compassion for students that with increasingly with emotional and other challenges in their lives. But we should also care about merit. And unfortunately, those other three things tend to align. There's kind of, we call it an elective affinity, which ends up making strange bedfellows out of quite a few faculty members. And so I have some sense of hopelessness about reversing this, just because all the forces go in that direction. One point we stressed in the paper that I feel compelled to stress now, not just for political reasons, but because I believe it. We're not about pointing fingers and saying, oh, you administrator, you just want to exploit adjuncts, or you faculty are just lazy and want to give all A's. It's not that that doesn't happen, but I don't think that's at root what the fundamental problem is. It's just everybody knows where their bread is buttered, and we're aligning our behavior where the incentives are. And I know it over the years, and Anthony and I and our other co-author in this piece, we've taught, I don't know how many we cited in the paper, 30 universities say over the last 30 years. And I've known it, that when I grade more rigorously, I get lower student evaluations. So that's just one piece of this puzzle. You have as tenured positions erode, those who do have it are going to hold on to it, and they're going to learn right away that they need to be, accommodating students. Yeah.
It's the other issue about sort of using, continuing with the same standards or the same reading material that's now probably they can't keep up with, those kinds of things, because people who aren't educators say to me, well, just don't let them use their phones. Just keep doing, just require them to read that, those journal articles instead of something, well, it's demoralizing in the classroom to have no one who's read the material. And so there's that too, where it's like, okay, I genuinely want my students to read something about this topic. If I don't choose something that is closer, even if I can't choose something exactly at grade level, if I can't choose something that's closer to their reading capabilities, how can I hope to have any kind of impact, any kind of class discussion, any kind of learning? So there's also just this genuine desire to teach, to have students engage with the material, to have students move through at least some of the some of the statistical tests. Okay, maybe we don't get to two-way ANOVA anymore. I have to take two-way ANOVA off the table because it takes longer to do everything else. And you could say, oh, well, that's, like you said, oh, you're just doing it because it's easier. Well, I'm also doing it because, to some extent, because I want most of them to learn something,
Right.
And if I don't take some things off the table, if I don't lower the difficulty of reading or the number of pages that they have to read. I mean, I engage, I'm sure you do this too. I mean, it is exhausting sometimes to try to find an article that it's got to have a sexy title, right? So that it's attention grabbing.
Right. Yes.
It's got to be under, it can't even go to 10 pages. So if it's 2 digits, so it's got to be under, it's got to be 9 pages or under, basically, preferably 7 or under. It's got to, there's all these things that I need, for the material in order for them to read a primary source. And that's not me giving up. That's me pushing the boundary, in my opinion. I don't know, maybe you disagree with me on that.
I wholeheartedly agree. I don't know if you're going to chime in.
There's one question in our survey that asks whether student engagement is the primary responsibility of the faculty. Now, of course, we would we all favor better pedagogy. There's room for improvement. Harness new technology to make our teaching come more alive. But I don't know. I think we're in a period now where if the students are not, or if they're bored, if somehow they're turned off, that it's pretty
It's our
much
fault.
it's the responsibility of the faculty member. I just think that's an unfortunate and inaccurate assessment.
Yeah. How did people answer that? I don't remember how people answered that question on the survey.
Most of our questions had pluralities rather than majorities. So we have the larger plurality. Let me see. Let me make sure I get one of the numbers right here that I wanted to share. Yeah, 40% do not suspect that students are studying as much. So, and that's larger than the number that do think they are. So there's this rising perception that students are not studying and yet they're demanding more. 37%, again, a plurality, larger than those who disagree, that student pushback on grades has increased in recent years. 59% affirm playing a more emotionally supportive, if not therapeutic role with students over the years. So you have all of these, this is why we talk about this as an affinity. We have these cultural, psychological forces, everything's interconnected. It's connected to changes in technology. It's connected to changes in the economy, that we believe if there's any concept that comes out of our paper, apart from the broke, woke, stroke convergence, I would say the perverse incentives that we're all under. And I think you articulated it really well, Elizabeth. You're like, it's not about not wanting to do work. It's about getting something for these students, under circumstances that are dire. We asked faculty members because a third of them openly acknowledge watering down their courses, how many more, we had mass exodus of people who didn't take the survey. We suspect it's probably higher than that. The ones taking our survey shows a sort of self-selection, willingness to take it. So if, you have a third openly acknowledging it, we asked respondents if that does a disservice. If you're watering down your courses, does that do a disservice to, the more gifted students? And you had mentioned quotes, but one of the most disturbing ones, if I can find it, one of many though, there's so many, and you and Mike captured them quite well in your talk, but they said, I see this as a code for a racist and sexist meritocratic stance.
Yeah.
Just ask the question, does it harm the gifted students if you water down your courses? That's a racist and sexist meritocratic stance. So that's the perception. And it's, again, it has to do with this political psychology part that you and Mike didn't quite touch on, but it's important, which is left liberal people really are. If the literature in political psychology is accurate, left liberal people actually have different underlying emotions that has a partially biological or genetic influence. And there's literature now in political science, major researchers associated with the work of John Hibbing and his associates looking at the biology of political orientation. So you're getting people that really are emotively different than other people overwhelming higher ed. And it's not a healthy thing, because we both politically and intellectually, we're impoverishing our students and we're graduating students. We have another question on, we're graduating some functionally illiterate students, and strong plurality agreed with that they are.
Yeah.
So what are we doing if students are getting through? And then imagine a faculty member who wants to have integrity in this situation, or you'd have to be tenured, first of all, and then you're going to be dealing with so much blowback.
It's not worth it. And so what happens is people like me, I take a halftime administrative appointment. I get out of the classroom. Like it's like, I got to get out of the classroom because I can't take it anymore. I'm getting, and at one point you start to feel like, well, I know I'm providing an opportunity to learn. And sort of like Anthony said, if they're not taking it, then at some point you have to let go of your own responsibility, of your personal responsibility to make every student engaged and excited and everything about learning. And it makes me sad. It really does make me sad. And by the way, Mike and I did cover an article on environmental perceptions, and people who were they didn't measure political orientation strictly. They used social dominance orientation. They used some measures of egalitarianism. And what they noticed was that people who were more egalitarian noticed different things in their environment. So then, and people who were more authoritarian noticed, other things in their environment. And so I think that we can all, I mean, this is basic psychology, right? Confirmation bias. And so, I think that I, I think we're trying really hard to reach over the aisle and say, prove us wrong. I'm not seeing a hand coming across from the other side saying, prove us wrong. In fact, your study, my study, really has demonstrated the opposite, that people lashed out, they quit your survey. And as you say, the numbers of people, what was your response rate, like 10%? Actually, I think it was
Yes,
about
it
10%.
was 10. Yeah, just,
and honestly, as somebody who's done research in the field, for industry, 10% is great. It really is. That's what you would hope for. And you actually got feedback as to why people opted out and stuff. Most surveys you just never get a response. I just read, just a few minutes before we started, I was reading an article about social work. So have you ever surveyed social work?
we haven't. No.
Okay. So about 20 years ago was the last time that I think an article was published on, political ideology and stuff in social work. So I think it was about 20 years ago. But at least that I could find. But here's something really fascinating. So they did a study, a survey study. They got a 20% response rate. And it was like, and not only that, but it's overwhelmingly, liberal. Now, the way that they didn't frame their questions like you did. They didn't do what you did and ask questions in sort of provocative ways. They asked particular kinds they used a scale that did have some, some reverse scoring and that kind of thing. But they certainly did not ask provoking questions like you did. And they got now when I read that, a 20% response rate, I'm like, that's highly unusual, actually. I mean, that's off the charts as far as, a survey sent to your email, yeah. So, but social work, I challenge, so I vote for social work next, because I think that they're, well, I think it's it's not only just in the classroom. I mean, they're being, encouraged. Social activism is actually part of their code of ethics. And so, let's talk about self-selection. I mean, and kicking out the people that don't agree. So we have touched on this, about non-left contingencies feeling sort of, unwelcome on campus, and hiring discrimination. And in fact, I'm not sure if it's Inbar or Kaufman. I'm not sure which one, Kaufman with K, who found that liberal left-leaning, especially, the radical left-leaning people would not even sit next to someone for lunch that they believed disagreed with them politically. Right-leaning people did not behave that way, but left-leaning did. Left-leaning people were far more likely to say that they would not approve a grant, that they would, reject a paper that disagreed with certain perspectives. We certainly have seen this. You're probably not part of the American Psychological Association or Association for Psychological Society, because you're in sociology. But we've had lots of arguments about this. I don't know what the what is it, the ASA? Would it be the ASA?
Yeah.
I don't know what your ethics codes or anything, or what's been going on, but certainly within the American Psychological Association, there's been lots of infighting and, racial justice initiatives, editors being fired because they tried to, Perspectives in Psychological Science, like the flagship of APS, fired because he tried to create a situation within a journal issue, typical. We have a main article and responses. but one thing that I think that this article, and I think that your article did a better job of this. I think this little article that, I had sent you, this opinion piece, does not do a very good job of, is really talking about the boots on the ground sort of, they're saying, oh, they sort of like non-left constituencies feel increasingly unwelcome on campus. I mean, I think that's a massive understatement. I mean, I am a left-leaning person also, and you all have declared yourselves, left. I mean, I said I'm so glad that you two have each other. When I went to FIRE, when I presented at Heterodox, my colleagues say that those are right-wing organizations.
Right.
So I think that there are a lot of little people, out there who are miserable, this sort of like this sort of noise of misery, of feeling that they can't. And it isn't about speaking out about something right wing. It's just speaking out at all, asking the question. Anthony was saying, what the question that you asked, like, well, Mark too, like, what have you read recently? That's, or, Anthony's question, like, well, is anyone willing to entertain, an alternative here? I would not feel comfortable even asking those questions in my own department. And so I really, I'm biased by my own experience, but I really feel that it's understated how, because it's not just non-left constituents, it's non-radical left constituents who feel lonely and a bit lost. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's if anything that you have done has pointed that direction, that it's not just the right, but it's everyone other than the radical left who feels a little bit lonely.
Many sociologists, and Anthony, if you want to chime in, I don't mean to
No,
dominate.
go right in.
Yeah,
No.
many sociologists in our survey, our prior one called Sociology of Sacred Victims, expressed significant degree of discontent, where they don't feel they can speak out. They don't feel they can talk about issues that run counter the assumptions of their field. So for example, there's an ongoing empirical debate in social science. Anthony and I consider it extremely important, which is the question of whether diverse migratory flows into a society creates predictable breakdown in social cohesion. So this has its roots in Emile Durkheim. It's a major question. The sort of dominant view coming out of left liberal academia is diversity is intrinsically a strength. It's always a good thing. And it's become such a sacred value that can we even ask the question whether migratory flows can undermine social cohesion, or can anybody in the public be opposed to immigration for reasons that aren't reducible to racism, for example? Could you be concerned about identity and culture and shared sense of unity? And what we found, this was probably the most glaring finding in that prior survey. Just over half of sociologists in our survey said that they reject any research that could inform the debate over whether diversity could lead to breakdown in social cohesion. So they don't even want research that could potentially harm. Now, when you break that down politically, what you're going to find is, as you go to the right, and of course there's virtually nobody on the right in my field, but as you move toward moderates are much more inclined to affirm the importance of research into migration and social cohesion. Radicals, absolutely not. It's kind of like this: I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear it, and that suggests to us that there's a sacralization. There's a deep emotional and ideological commitment to the value of diversity that renders off limits inquiry into this. And this is just one of so many other questions that we've asked over. And like, as I know you're going to put the Scientific American link there, but it'll show some other questions in different fields that end up being these hot button questions. We don't go to the hot buttons to be like provocative for its own sake or anything like that. We go to it because our society is deeply polarized. We're not unified in any meaningful way. And we have to figure out some strategies to bring about a greater degree of social peace. I'm not a big fan of like, oh, can we just get along or communicate better?
Wouldn't it be lovely?
Yeah. So we need real institutional change, and it is going to have to take. I don't know. I don't know if other people can do what I did, and I'm not waving a flag about how great it was because it's been painful in my own life, frankly. But through reading Jonathan Haidt, through reading Steven Pinker and others, to go out of your way to begin to take on arguments that make you uncomfortable is such an important thing to communicate to students today. So,
Yeah.
and if you do it in a fair-minded way, and they can, and I'm open about my own political values and the arc of my own political identity with them too. I think it really is a healthy way to try to, little tiny bubbles become waves, and maybe we can push back against this cultural movement. I don't know, Anthony, if you had any thoughts on that too.
Well, one thing just to follow up on what Mark just said, one thing I've become more and more convinced of, in part as a result of the conversations I've had with Mark and my reading of Haidt and others, is that our intellectual work is shaped in profound ways by the moral, emotive space that we occupy. So that there are these moral and emotive assumptions that lead us to raise certain questions, act with perhaps anger and disgust if other questions are asked that are not consistent with the moral, emotive space that I or we inhabit. So I guess I'm just appreciating the connection between moral, emotive space on the one hand and truth claims on the other, that they're interconnected. And unless the first step in doing better science is to acknowledge that connection, which and that's a tough sell to get many of our colleagues to say, are you aware of the fact that your science is influenced by your moral, emotive predispositions? I don't know. I think they probably at that point would think, like, look at us as if we had 10 heads. But I don't know. I don't think they really. They have to get to that point of recognizing.
I think they're more than willing, in fact, happy to accuse, say, me, of my morals influencing my science, because they think that my morals are the wrong ones, right? That so well, we lost Mark there.
Oh my God.
Hopefully he'll pop back in. That like, if people think that, my morals reflect the way that I did research, but I think you're right. They don't believe that their own morals reflect the way that they do research. So yeah, I think that's kind of, I totally agree. And I mean, actually, Mark and I had a phone conversation, a couple weeks ago, before, when we were deciding to do this. And one of the things that I told him is that I'm personally quite fascinated with hypocrisies of that in my own processing. And so when somebody points out that I've been hypocritical, I'm like, oh, I find this quite interesting about myself. How is it that I come to, this conundrum, this, like, I believe in X and I also believe in Y, and those two things don't go together. And I find that, I think that's part of being an academic, is to find these things interesting and fascinating, to question yourself. How do my morals and political stance and emotions and values impact my research? And how should I approach my science knowing that? And I again, that's something that I would not feel comfortable asking my immediate colleagues, I'm sorry to say.
Mark and I have had many discussions about the dangers of having, whether it's right or left, of having operating with a closed system, which is not penetrable to new facts or new discoveries. But I think we see that sort of some would regard as almost a quasi-religious approach that some people take. Now we're focusing more on the left because but it certainly goes for wherever, even if you're on the right. I don't think that certainly gets in the way of good science. Let's put it that way. Whether yeah.
And this is a reason for everyone to care about it, because they might have, whoever you are, whatever the they is, might have the upper hand today. But if you go down this path of more essentially a moral clause at the IRB, for example, then when you don't have the upper hand, you're the one that's going to be, that the moral clause is going to come for. And again, this is something that I find, I find it really difficult to reach people on those kinds of things. Can you change your perspective in order to realize that, you may need to lean heavily on academic freedom yourself someday.
All right. I wonder if I could chime in with a couple examples from this. And I don't think you and Mike, just a couple of data points that I think would be interesting briefly. Yeah. And it reflects this whole idea, because our hope is that, going back to Anthony's point, when academics realize their moral emotive spaces influence how they think and how the role of their politics, as political identities linked to your moral emotions, that at least holds some hope for them to go, hey, maybe I am being biased in some way. So just here's a couple examples. Now, Anthony and I strongly disagree with these points, but we don't need to go into the empirics of it as we want. But let me just read these to you. So, and it's broken down by political orientation. We have a question that we call our educational romanticism question, which is basically, the question was, virtually all students admitted with serious academic deficits can excel in a challenging curricular environment with sufficient academic and university support. So it's like we're saying virtually all with serious deficits can excel, right? And then we found that 73% of radicals agree with that, 51% of liberals, and 29% of moderate faculty. So we just find that to be fanciful, wishful thinking that you can just take, and there's this belief, though, again, going back to the egalitarianism of left liberal faculty, there's this belief, no, everybody can do it. Just support them enough. And oddly, it puts us in the defensive, because Anthony and I are very often at pains to say we support a robust student infrastructure of support, but has it gone too far? And we think it has. And the other question that I wanted to highlight briefly, are standardized tests like the SAT culturally discriminatory, if not racist, basically? And we don't believe they are. We think they're a useful tool. We think tests have been honed for decades to eliminate any potential bias. That's our view. But 77% of radicals affirm that they're racist, 62% of liberals, and 33% of moderates.
Froze.
So again, these very elementary... Oh, did I freeze? Oh, it's unfortunate.
You did freeze. Okay. So 77% of what?
Yeah, so 77% of radicals believe standardized tests are racist, 62% of liberals, and 33% of moderates. So, so it's just an example. I know it's a sensitive topic, but we just don't believe that they're biased. They've been honed for decades to eliminate bias. They have the same predictive power, regardless of the race of the student. So it's here's just one example, and the other example of this kind of educational romanticism, showing how out of whack your political sensibilities can be with regard to certain claims about the world.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It really doesn't matter what we believe, right? So much, and you believe as creators of the survey, but as much as it matters that the political divide is so strong, and we know that the political skew is so strong in universities, that students then are, I would say, suffering from, they're certainly not benefiting from this. They're maybe their GPA is benefiting, if you call it that, but they're certainly not benefiting from the belief that for promoting the belief, which starts in like lower grades education, that you have a learning style and I have a teaching style, and if you didn't do well, it's only because we didn't match up. Right. I wasn't able to reach you, because it's my job as a teacher to adapt my teaching style to your learning style, right? So they learn that from early on, and teachers are taught that in education programs. And that then, sort of rises up to, to our level, where we start to believe that everyone's capable, everyone's equally capable of math. Now, if we ask any parent, are your kids equally capable of they're going to say no. Like, one's better at this and the other's better at that. In every marriage or relationship, people tend to gravitate towards doing the chores or the activities. One person takes over the tech, right? Every time you have a problem, you say, honey, my, whatever's not working. These are the kinds of things, that people they realize intuitively. But if we're teaching our college courses with the assumption that, well, if you didn't do well, it's because I failed you, how are they to ever be encouraged to step up, right? So how are we to ever evaluate our peers when it comes time to do that for tenure or promotion or reappointment or whatever? If we believe the feedback that this professor didn't meet my needs, and we believe that that's the most important thing, how are we to change this? And I agree with you. It's like it feels a little depressing. I'm not sure how we can change these mindsets. And the final sentence of this article is, the only remaining question then is how long the public will continue to pay for a university system that no longer aligns with its values or educational priorities. I mean, when you go out when you say, I don't know if either one of you, has, I don't know, hangs out with other parents or people who are in K through 12 in general. Like I don't have any kids of my own, but I hear people at the gym and, that kind of stuff. And I'll say, well, you shouldn't assume that just because your kid's doing well in college or whatever, your kid's doing well in the 6th grade or the 2nd grade or whatever, that doing well, that they're learning the things that you think are important for them to learn. Like, can they, make change? Can they like function? Can they measure out to cook and those kinds of things? And they follow a recipe. Can you find other ways to sort of test whether they're learning? Because you shouldn't assume that just because your child is doing well, or what, oh no, but Susie's doing great. Oh, they're doing great. Like, so I don't know how to communicate this to people. They can't understand the soup that we're in because it doesn't match up with their educational experience. Are you having that conversation? How do you have those conversations with people in the community?
By the way, I think according to the latest data I've seen, I think the U.S. is now like 39th in the world when it comes to like STEM
Really?
fields. I don't know. I don't want to, but we're not at the top. So there's been, obviously, if you think that those metrics are valid, then there's a problem, right?
But do
in terms
individual
of
people,
rigor and
right?
right.
Do individual people believe it about their own kids, about their own college age K through 12 student? I see a universal rejection. Like, they say, oh yeah, it's a problem, but my kid is doing great. My grandchild is doing great. Whatever. I don't know.
I think as more from the high school teachers, I have a number of friends that teach in high schools, and they talk about basically the same kind of reality. I didn't look into the literature on it. I read a little of it in terms of grade inflation and basically never holding people back anymore. Just pushing them through. So maybe they think their kids are doing great because all their kids are getting through, where in the old days they didn't. That would be a hypothesis to explore on this, but it's also very troubling. And just briefly going back to the issue of standardized tests, I've spoken with administrators at the college level, and what they'll basically say is they'll say, well, we can't reinstitute the standardized tests because then we're going to lose our own enrollment.
Right.
So unless everybody decides we're going to bring it back, so again, I'm going to say perverse incentives. I'm not blaming the high school administrator. I'm not blaming the high school teachers. I'm not saying we're blameless, don't misunderstand me, because it's ultimately our agency that is the only way we're going to be able to solve these problems. But at the end of the day, it's deeply structural. It's rooted in the nature of our market system, the financial realities that we're facing, the cultural realities we're facing. And can we get the kind of public financing we had in the post-war era back? Probably not. We call that a kind of quixotic dream in the paper. But it would be the only way to take pressure off grading. Because if I know a student's life isn't going to be destroyed by failing them, I'm much more inclined to do so. So, yeah, so many things. I agree with you, Elizabeth. It's happening on the high school level as well, if not earlier.
Well, I just don't know how to have this conversation with people other than yourselves, other than my, the little circle, because I'm, what, you create your own bubble. And like, I just don't know how to reach out beyond that to talk to other people and how to, to tell them that, to, to look into it in their own lives and, to reflect on and to help their kids reflect on, am I learning something or am I just going through the motions? And do I care about that? Look, you don't have to care about every single course that you take. I mean, there are courses that you go through the motions and you get your B or whatever, and you're like, okay, thank God that's over with. It wasn't my thing. But to, as you advance in your field, to reflect on your own educational experience, teaching our kids to do that, and what do they care about, and how to, I don't know, cultivate that caring for that value, that get back to valuing knowledge. I don't know. I mean, Anthony, you've been teaching a long time. I mean, this is something I've noticed. Maybe you've noticed too, that I just don't see students valuing knowledge for its own sake.
We could talk a lot about that, but if I can put in a quick plug for something Mark and I were involved in last fall at our university, there was a conference, Civilizational Prospects, where we had faculty give presentations on major issues that will confront our civilization over the next 25, 50 years for the rest of this century. So I think our argument is that we need the best minds to work on these issues. So we need to value excellence. So I think our call for front-loading merit and excellence as part of the value mix of higher ed, and I think that's where we're coming from. We need the best minds. I'm not even sure the elite universities are producing the best minds with all of the indoctrination and ideology. But I think we should be trying to cultivate the best minds. Excellence should be valued because we have significant civilizational challenges to address this century. And I just don't think the way we're structured right now is fostering the development of those kinds of the kinds of minds we need. So that I think that's where we're coming from, I think.
How was that received?
Well, conference. What do you think, Mark? The conference was well received. I don't know if we got into the sort of the backstory of it all. But what do you think? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I was thinking about Elizabeth's earlier point. I mean, it is an interesting empirical question, the extent to which students are, because we gauge faculty perception of student preparedness plummeting. I think it's highly likely because they're getting pushed through elementary school and high school. And so part of it is that excellence itself, like some of the respondents in our survey, is felt as a kind of affront to the dignity of the vulnerable student who's not doing well. And since the egalitarian can't acknowledge individual differences in ability, it has to be a social structural thing. And therefore, we're all sort of complicit and we have to sort of make amends. So yeah, it's how are we going to solve these problems? How are we going to solve climate change? How are we going to deal with late stage capitalism and automation? I mean, deep problems in our ecology and our economy that require massive public trust at a time when we have all the Pew polls. I was looking at them prior when we prepared the study. Lowest ratings of institutional trust that we've ever seen in this country. So yeah, we could all sort of get in a group hug right now with pessimism, because I think pessimism's realism
Yeah.
right now, sadly.
Yeah. So we need all the great minds. I agree. I think this is a great, it's like a call, right, for the great minds to get around, the future. And I really, really quickly, either Mark or Anthony, would you remind us these three: broke, woke, stroke? What are those? These are the things that we need people to realize are influencing, and that we need the smartest minds to get around solving these issues that broke, woke, stroke has created. So if you would just summarize real quick what those are.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth, because we do think the meme is useful, because it helps capture such a wide array of conversations in literature right now. So the broke component, these are institutional and cultural forces that are intersecting, that are eroding standards slowly in our society and threatening to undermine our capacity to deal with our most severe social problems down the road. So the broke component is corporatization. We have cash-strapped universities. Certainly since the 80s, there was this massive shift towards student finance, basically student debt financing, a reduction in federal and state support for higher education that puts universities in this very difficult position where an administrator, just going back to the standardized test thing, it's like, well, I don't want to do anything that's going to affect our enrollments. So there's this inertial pressure toward accepting more and more students that are less and less prepared. There's a pressure on eliminating tenured positions, doing a kind of amenities arms race so that, we have a big pool, come to our university. So there's a kind of corruption of the entire institution that flows out of that financial reality. Anthony and I probably give more weight to corporatization, although Anthony gives weight to it as well. How you disentangle these three things, they're all operating in tandem. The woke component has to do with rising sensitivity with regarding disparities by gender, but primarily by race. And so that means these disparities are increasingly being politicized. We cited a statement by the president of Brooklyn College, where Anthony's alma mater, where they basically said faculty who have disparities by race will get development. We need development as faculty if students perform differently by race. Very, very concerning in terms of putting pressure on standards. And then, as we said earlier, the stroke part, we're a little looser. It's about stroking the ego. So broke, woke, and stroke cultural forces, stroking the ego of increasingly vulnerable students. There's a wide range, usually on the political right. Discussion, I think, has a big chunk of truth to it. We're seeing high rates of mental illness or purported mental illness, kind of hypertherapeutic culture, which kind of rewards a spirit of victimization, where all of a sudden you're courageous by saying you're a victim, something like that. And all of these things in their intersection erode standards down the road. And we need to be aware of the broke, woke, stroke convergence, and we need to reclaim the traditional, I will say, conservative values of merit and grit. Anthony, did I miss something?
To add to that?
Well, I don't know if I missed anything.
So basically, the values then are solvency, right? Like we don't want to see, no one wants to see our institution go bankrupt, all right? So, I mean, that's a real value, all right? Solvency, equity, compassion, but I think we just want to put merit more into that mix. So the challenge is, how do you can't maximize them, but how do you, satisfy these four, right? I think we just need to have serious conversations in higher education as to how best to do that. And I certainly believe that viewpoint diversity would lead to a better, richer, more productive, more generative conversation.
And that's using the woke's argument, actually, to extending the woke's argument to diversity more broadly, which they're not too necessarily open to. But I do like your idea, Anthony, or that you all presented it. You said at your conference. I think that the focus on viewpoint diversity is great, and I hadn't really thought about it until you sort of reframed it, that that's addressing a symptom, right? It's helpful, and it's a little shot of insulin for the diabetic or whatever. It's certainly helpful, and you need that. But you're right, like this sort of challenge, this call to for the great minds to sort of solve this problem, I think is maybe more enticing and sexier, than let's inject some viewpoint diversity, hoping that helps with the chronic disease that we have. No, let's put the best minds onto this disease and see if we can't offer a cure as opposed to just a short-term injection. So I hope that people answer that call, and that you keep asking, that you keep putting it out there. I so appreciate you coming. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked that I didn't get to ask?
We appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely, it has been wonderful.
Present our
I think
work.
there's lots more to
share
talk
our
about,
ideas.
and hopefully we can have you back and talk about some of the other things you've published or that you're working on for the future. So.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Elizabeth. It's been
Thank you, Elizabeth,
Thank
so
you.
much.